Good morning, ex-Winterview, back with a brief dialogue for his dear friend Annastacey, again in his car, the travelling mystic, ex-Winterview, on his way for a surf, I hope, maybe a shop, maybe a movie. What a fun day in store for ex-Winterview. This dialogue is one I've had a crack at a couple of times and haven't really been able to say what I wanted, so here we go again. Take 3. This is about the fantasy, and this partly comes out of my work in mental health and is in some ways relevant to the broader discussion on liberation, enlightenment, etc., so on. One of the things we notice in mental health with individuals who present with clinically severe symptoms enough to warrant seeing a psychologist, clinical psychologist even, is a stunning lack of imagination and fantasy for themselves. Or we see the opposite, an inflated, exaggerated fantasy about themselves or about the world. Let me give you both examples. The first one, with a stunning lack of fantasy, we often see with young people, children, etc., who come in from a background of neglect and abuse, or abuse, you could say. And for these young people, for some reason, perhaps the brain development has been arrested in some ways, or there's a family culture of a lack of imagination, perhaps. Whatever the reason, I'm not going to go into the reasons perhaps today, but there's a lack of inner fantasy about themselves and a lack of outer fantasy about the world, which you could say is curiosity. There's no real curiosity about the world. Everything's very centered around where they live, and the most immediate people in their lives are literally their entire universe. When you ask these people about goals and ambitions and dreams and so forth, about what they'd like to do, etc., etc., there aren't any. Or they're just so normal that you wouldn't even... It's more of a baseline for most people, like to have a good meal, to watch a movie that's coming up at the cinema, really day-to-day kind of stuff, or even a stunning lack of anything, just a shrug of the shoulders, like, what are you talking about, kind of deal. And we notice in the dreams of these people, literally the sleeping dreams, there's not much going on there either. They're very fleeting, perhaps rehashing the day's events, perhaps imagining of tomorrow in a very realistic way, but only very fleeting. And dreams are not remembered very often. The other subset we get in the clinic are the inflated imagination, the inflated fantasy. This is where the person is imbued with powers and amazingness beyond what you would consider reasonable or real. And we frequently see this in the case with the diagnosis of certain personality disorders, where the central agent or imagined person is desperately in a fantasy to be amazing the whole time, and very peculiar ways of fantasizing about the world as well. And you get these in sort of sexually deviant disorders as well, very peculiar fantasies about what will arouse the body in that particular case, very specific and unusual requirements just for that. These fantasies and you can have grandiose fantasies of power and beauty and fame, all imagined, and in some cases you get this rich inner fantasy about like a withdrawal into a fantasy world, which is extremely rich, and these people are often sort of introverted on the outside, and socially anxious perhaps, yet have this incredible, rich inner fantasy world. There is some function, you could say, of the fantasy. The fantasy is the mind taking the imagined central self that it takes to be at the center of the universe and protects it. The self is protected in some ways from the awfulness of being a self. And being a self, let's be clear about this, isn't very nice. The self, as it's imagined, was born, will live a finite amount of years, and will die. And the death is uncertain. It could be swift, it could be slow, it could be suddenly tomorrow, it could be in a few years. It's an awful razor's edge to be living in for the self, and there's an existential awfulness about that. So the function of the fantasy, you might say, is to buffer or to protect that imagined self. Therefore, the fantasy is in some ways part of the functioning of the imagined separate self. Now, when I say fantasy, it's a fantasy of the self in the world. It's like a double combo. It's who you are and where you are. Space-time fantasy. Not to be confused with someone who just has a really good imagination. So, for example, if you worked in advertising and your job was to create incredible imaginative experiences, or in a media job, for example, that's not the same thing. This awfulness of the seeker is, as I said earlier, this you might die any moment existential angst is also the basis for what we call trauma in psychology. Trauma is often imagined to be a very, very, very unpleasant event that somehow happens to you in certain circumstances and you never really quite get over, and you feel kind of crap forever after. That's a very layperson's definition. But when you look at trauma as a subject, it becomes very complex and very interesting quickly, in that not every negative or unpleasant event impacts people in the way you would imagine. In fact, in some cases, people become more resilient after a very unpleasant event. So why is it then some people have this sort of unpleasant negative reaction, whereas some take it on board and take it on the chin and become stronger and grow and become more resilient as a result? The clue is about the fantasy. It's the way that the trauma impacts on the fantasy, or the way the experience, I should say, impacts on the fantasy. Something that negatively impacts on the fantasy becomes traumatic. So, for example, and this is quite a common one, you might have a very rich fantasy about your beauty, about how you look physically, and you might actually be quite pretty or attractive in some way. But when it's fantasized, it could be exaggerated. And not only exaggerated, but imbued with importance and power. My life's meaning and power and purpose is wrapped up in my attractiveness, for example. I get what I want in this world because I'm beautiful. You know, people love me for it. All those silly things that the imagination might tell you. But what happens if you need surgery on your face to, say, remove a skin cancer or some kind of medical reason that you need surgery? The surgeon might sit you down and go, look, here's the deal. We're going to be cutting a big chunk of your face away to save your life. Now, you'd rather be alive than dead, the surgeon thinks. But actually, they're not just cutting into your face, they're cutting into the fantasy of the self and the way the self operates in the fantasy world. I can't be this fantastically attractive person in my imagination if you're going to be cutting into my face. And now that event becomes traumatic, possibly, if it cannot be integrated quickly into the fantasy, if it shatters the fantasy, you've got trauma. Let's maybe give it an example give it a spin where it is taken well. Perhaps it's the face is cut and there's a big scar, going across the face. And in some ways, let's say it's a male, for example, the male might go, this is now I survived cancer scar. And it's a real badge of honor. Like I'm hardcore. Look at me, man. I had cancer and I got over it. I beat it. I mean, the surgeon cut it out, but let's not ruin the fantasy. And now in conversation, when people notice your scar, it's like there's a bit of delight in it. Yeah, I got this because I had cancer, but I totally beat it, and I'm alive because of my amazingness. It really is integrated well. But what if it wasn't taken what if the fantasy was ruptured? Suddenly, the self is weakened. It's got a problem. It cannot function as it used to. All the narratives and stories around the self don't work anymore because I've got a giant scar in my face. Yet I see myself as a pretty little princess, and now I cannot be a pretty little princess because of this huge, whopping, great scar that runs down my face. So now I cannot operate in that fantasy, or rather, the fantasy cannot function as it used to, and it's traumatic. And then there could be a new fantasy, like the loss. I used to have everything, but now I'm bereft. I've lost it all. Life is meaningless. Anyway, the point of this subject was how to point out some more wonderful ways that the self functions. It functions in this paradigm of fantasy. And people, gets really funny. Individuals keep in their fantasies. They talk to each other from the perspective of their fantasies. And one of the wonderful things about the fantasy is because, remember, it's based on this awful underlying existential angst that the individual feels. Because remember, the individual lives in an awfulness, in a time-bound, I'm going to die, I've got to make the most of my life world. That's where the individual lives, the conceptualized individual. And because of its finite nature, it clings, or it longs for the infinite. It longs for anything that is eternal or somehow transcendent of this awful limitation that it feels. And the best way to transcend finiteness or limitation is to fantasize, or align yourself, that is, about infinite or imagined infinite principles or universal principles, beauty, love, romance, truth, justice, all these sparkling principles. If I can align my fantasy within that, I transcend the awfulness. And these are very powerful, motivating archetypes, you could say, that people line up for. You see it in fringe, what are they called? Fundamentalist organizations who go around killing people for God. But within the organization itself, it's not just about let's go kill some people, although there might be some people sitting there who are really into that. But for the most part, it's let's align ourselves with a greater truth than the awfulness of being a self. Let's align ourselves with God's love. That's a really powerful, eternal, transcendent fantasy that one can align themselves with and become part of in their own fantasies. And now, yesterday I was Fred Smith, unemployed, no-hoper fantasy, and suddenly I'm in the fantasy of God's love, or some sort of grandiose ideal like that. Suddenly, this is great, I've left the old crappy life behind in an instant, and I've aligned myself with something greater than myself. And of course, then you've got the downsides within those organizations, which I won't go into. I've done that in another talk. You see it in disorders like eating disorders, for example. In the clinic, you have a common mechanism within the eating disorder is an idealized or over-stylized ideal of beauty that the individual is trying to desperately align themselves with. And it becomes more pernicious when it's tied in with beauty, love, and power. Power and control. These are big, fat, universal fantasy principles that the eating disorder satisfies very well. And what the problem for the clinician is, on the one hand, they think, oh, I'm treating an eating disorder, but actually, on a more sort of metaphysical level, they're trying to shift someone away from these very powerful addictive principles. These are very addictive because they're felt in a very sort of the subjective experience of transcending your limitations with these big fat principles is very powerful. It's very compelling. You're not readily going to give it up. You see it also in the negative as well. You see it with drug and alcohol addictions sometimes. This is the very powerful archetype or fantasy of the loser or the struggling, helpless victim is a great fantasy. This is someone who, maybe on recognizing the futility and frustration of being that limited conceptual self, not literally explicitly realizing that, but sensing that life kind of sucks. Really, it does suck. I'm just here for a short time, and then I might die. What a great summary of life. But that is in fact more or less the truth for the individual. That's why there's an existential angst there. So I'm going to become the lovable loser. I'm just going to always have a bit of a struggle, get ahead, and then fall back into the drink, and then people are going to rally around and pull me out of it, and I feel a sense of belonging and community, and then back to the struggle. And the struggle is wonderful. The individual loves the struggle. The struggle, at least, is something to align with in a fantasy that takes me out of my life a bit. And of course, the subjective experience of intoxication, as short-lived as it is in many cases, can add another element to it. But the drug and alcohol workers often don't understand that they're dealing with a fantasy. And when they're saying to the person, stop drinking, stop taking drugs, not that they would ever just say that, but in essence that's what's being said in rehab or recovery. It's they're saying, don't have that fantasy anymore, pull out of the fantasy. Why would you do that? No one's going to leave their fantasy willingly. A more powerful fantasy is required to cause some kind of shift, or, in some cases, a realization of the emptiness of self can also cause a very powerful shift in behavior, because all fantasies are seen through suddenly as empty when it's realized that there isn't anyone having that fantasy. Anyway, I think I did a better job with that dialogue. The fantasy is often something that people we don't hear about enough, I think. And I hope this was a little bit interesting, a little bit informative. Comments are welcome. Thank you.